in a process which happens when consciousness as a dimension is added to time-space. The three dimensions of space become a four-dimensional continuum when time is factored in. But when consciousness is factored in, it becomes a five-dimensional continuum. So you have to deal with five dimensions. And just as space is deeply modified, not to say transformed, by the factoring in of time, so the factoring in of consciousness makes a five-dimensional continuum. So that the processes of vision and history are totally different from the processes of nature and myth. Let's make it even stronger. The way in which nature works is the way in which language works. Language and nature are simpatico. They work in the same ways. How do they work? They integrate. They bring together. In nature, gravity brings things together. In nature, centripetal and centrifugal forces always, though they move in different directions, have the same net result, and that is to aggregate, so that nature as a process produces existence. Not just the things, but the fact that they are movements that converge. To the yogic eye, it isn't things that make this universe real, but it's the convergence of processes that function as things. That's where existence is. That's where objectivity is. The easiest way to imagine this is a crisscross of waves, and where the waves crisscross, at that juncture, you have apparent things. Things are apparent. One can learn to do a perceptual analysis that can undo that knot. The school that was developed even before the time of the historical Buddha was called Yogacara, which means mind only. It means that the mind can be powerful enough to undo the knots that nature makes and to resolve them again into their wave fronts. But these integrative focuses of interpenetrating waves, complex as they are in nature, are even more complex in language. Language objects are extremely difficult to undo. And usually what's referred to as high dharma is someone who's learned to undo the knots of language things, to unravel the forms that the processes of language have made. It's true it takes a good yogi to undo the knots of nature, but it takes a very high yogi to undo the knots of language. But you can undo them. But when consciousness is added as a dimension to time-space, the knots are of a different nature. They're not knots of integration. They are complications of differentiation. And a high Dharma yogi in a differential mode does not undo, but brings together. The secret is to know that in this scale, on this scale of reality, in this five-dimensional continuum, analysis does not undo, but analysis brings together. It's a different process. It's a complementarity process to the other. So that the processes of vision and history do not make forms that are to be undone analytically to be understood, but to be opened up, thereby being understood. Now, when somebody speaks like this, forthright and simple, it sounds very easy to understand. It's one of the most difficult things there is to understand. Very difficult. Very few people understand this. And almost no one knows how to do this by this particular time in the 20th century. Which is why we go to Thucydides and Benjamin Franklin, because these are individuals who were able to operate more or less in a five-dimensional continuum. With Thucydides, because it was very new, he's somewhat, I wouldn't say a novice, but he's new to it, so he doesn't have a critical background and tradition. And yet, at the same time, I'm using Franklin because Franklin also does not have an extensive critical background. The Franklin of the early 1700s in the colony of Massachusetts is just as disadvantaged as Thucydides of 2,400 years ago, but just as brilliant as Thucydides of 2,400 years ago. Just as brilliant in respect to the fact that they are able to understand that with a differential process, the forms of differentiation must be unfolded and unfolded in a five-dimensional continuum. The three dimensions of space, the dimension of time, and the dimension of consciousness. Fivefold. So that the symbol for natural analysis is the square. Or you can even say the circle. When you're trying to understand forms that are integrated, then one uses a square, one uses a circle as a kind of a symbolic key. But when consciousness, when the dimension of consciousness is added to forms, you cannot use the square, you cannot use the circle. You use the star and you use the spiral. They're totally different tools. The use of them is in a totally different methodology, yet the differences are like bookends. They're related together, they're paired. I don't know of a single case where someone in a learned way learned to use the star and the spiral before they learned to use the square and the circle. I don't know of a single case. Now, there are certain mystical geniuses that are born who can fathom what kind of karmic situations occurred. But there are rare individuals who, without knowing how to do complete perfect circles and least squares integrations, still know how to use the differential modes of stars and spirals. There are native mystical geniuses. Ramakrishna in the 19th century was a perfect example. Gandhi used to say that there were in his India, there were certain rare individuals who were, I think the phrase that he used is God-struck. They were blessed into very high conscious quality. And this very high conscious quality was a gift of the Spirit. But for almost everyone else, we have to learn. And ancient wisdom traditions always prepared a people to master enough of the conscious perspective to be able to appreciate and not be fearful of those who were going to function in this way. And the reason was very practical. If a people, if a population of men and women are not brought at least to the appreciation that these functions and these processes, different as they are from nature, are not a threat. They're not immoral. They're not evil. They're not fearsome mutations. They're not alien outsiders. But that they're a transformed version of themselves. And so even a tribal people had to be brought to the level to be able to appreciate that there are magical beings, as they would see someone who is conscious. And usually it was encapsulated by an example, the magician, the shaman, the seer, the oracle, the sibyl. Evenly split between men and women. For our purposes, the most common figure was an oracle. For Thucydides, it was the Delphic oracle. And the respect for the Delphic oracle was a respect for a human being who could function superiorly in a five-dimensional continuum without having had a complete sophisticated education on all the factors and stages in between. Frequently, the Delphic oracle was an early teenage girl. No way that she had an education under Plato, like Aristotle, for 20 years. No way. But she functioned as a living example that the supernatural is a part of the larger reality of human life. Now, what is very peculiar about this is that history as an energy mode is the highest level of that five-dimensional continuum. We have very curious kind of prejudice that somehow history is a high school subject. I mean, the devil loves that, right? So we don't pay any attention to it at all. It's something you have in the 10th grade or even like 7th grade, right? Middle school stuff. It's just like in the 10th grade when students are given geometry. And they say, oh, geez, I like geometry. I didn't like algebra. I like geometry. Whereas the shape of the mind, in order to appreciate geometry, is very supernatural. No natural mind can understand geometry at all. Why? Because those forms are transcendent. They function only in a five-dimensional continuum. They do not exist in nature. They do not exist even in language. You have to use a transform for language in order to have it. And once you've mastered geometry, the next level of trigonometry becomes available. And once you master that, then the whole double differential mode of calculus is within reach. And after that, the mathematical universe opens up, and one realizes, as indeed in the late 20th century, mathematicians around the world realized that there is an infinite world to explore in mathematics. There are more books, new, unique, novel books published in 1995 so far. We're only halfway through. There are more unique, new books about mathematical subjects that are not explored before than there have in all the history of the world before. And the same was true last year and the year before and the year before. It's like an asymptotic rise in realization that the universe of differential forms with a five-dimensional continuum is indeed infinite. It's an open-ended cosmos. And one of the qualities of the open-ended cosmos was succinctly posited by Socrates, who lived at the time of Thucydides. He was the first person to posit this, first person in history to understand this, and Socrates made it clear that he had understood what the Delphic oracle had said about him, that he was the wisest of all human beings. That he was wise not in respect of what he knew, but wise in respect that he could tell when he didn't know something. The wisdom of being very accurate about what you don't know, of realizing that this is out of your knowing, and therefore it's new, you have to explore it to find out, is the litmus test of whether consciousness is working or not. Now, if you're still holding on to a square reference, or if you're still functioning within a circular cycle, you cannot tell when something is new, when something is unknown, or where your knowing and your unknowing leave off. But with the form of a star, with the process of a spiral, you do know. You can tell. Now, in order to found this, because it tends to want to get abstract, this kind of talk tends to want to be ideational, which would be an unfortunate injustice perpetrated on you and also on myself to allow it to become an ideational only disquisition. That would indeed be a regression, a subconscious regression. So it has to be founded, and so I'm going to found it on Franklin and Thucydides. Let's come to Franklin first for just a little bit, then we'll go to Thucydides, then come back to Franklin. The historical form that was made during the lifetime of Benjamin Franklin was the United States. The United States is a five-dimensional form, differential form, and it leads very directly to a historical challenge that either delivers a cosmos or fails. In fact, in the early part of the 19th century, in between Jefferson and Lincoln, when the conscious assessment of what was going on was first brought into focus, the realization was that we're involved in a great experiment. And the metaphor for the United States was the great experiment. It was a great experiment to see whether men and women could bring a cosmos out of history or not. And the only success of the United States is if it establishes a conscious cosmos. It's a deeper archetype even than manifest destiny. It's the true motive for the frontier. One of the great American historians, a man named Turner, Frederick Jackson Turner, developed at the University of Wisconsin the frontier theory of American history. That American history moves by challenges of frontiers, and the response to perceived frontiers is the dynamic by which the United States has grown, has become what it is. And this led to the realization by Turner that the American West was, in his time, the 1920s, was the final frontier. It was as far as you could go without coming to the Pacific Ocean, and across the Pacific Ocean was only Asia. It didn't occur to Turner at that time that the American frontier, the next frontier beyond the West, would be Asia itself. And it wasn't until the 1950s that it occurred to people, visionaries like Jack Kerouac, that understanding Asia was the American frontier, the new frontier. It wasn't the Wild West, but it was the sophisticated Asia that was the frontier. And after wars against Japan, wars against Korea, wars against Vietnam, wars against China, wars against everybody in Asia, slowly the United States in the 1990s is beginning to realize that our response needs to be more mature and more conscious. We need to understand that this challenge was a challenge, again, of another frontier. And that indeed, beyond that, is the high frontier of space travel. But none of this is able to be done. We cannot function. We have no traction whatsoever. There's no efficacy for our activity in this process known as history without first founding our sense of person. Because persons are the only vehicle that has any traction in history whatsoever. Tribal groups have no traction in history. Cultural groups have no traction in history. Tribes and cultures have a lot of traction in myth. They function very well. They function much better than individuals in myth. The tribe and the culture function superiorly in language forms in myth. And it's only after a symbolic transformation that language is able to be used by an individual, and that is then able to be applied in the medium of history. Now, Benjamin Franklin, as an example, was working in himself. By the time he was 50 years of age, he had come to realize that the universal transcendent powers were available for conscious man to work with. Now, this had been understood by wisdom traditions for innumerable millennia. As long as there is any record of wisdom traditions on this planet, at the very beginnings of writing, not just in ancient Egypt, but in ancient Sumer, in ancient Elam before Sumer. Whenever writing has sprung into being, already there was a sophisticated conscious realization of all this. What made Franklin different was the scientific application was within physiological reach. It was not a mind-only penetration, but it was literally on level of mechanical, pick it up with your hands and apply it on an engineering basis. Benjamin Franklin is the first human being to realize that universal power was available for engineering projects, and the universal power was electricity. And Franklin is the first person anywhere on the planet. No Pythagoras, no Buddhist, no Taoist, nobody before Franklin actually did the experiments, actually came to understand what it was he had done consciously, and realized that he had freed a universal power, the power of electricity, to be used and applied to man's capacity to extend himself, to achieve work done. This was done in the 1740s, and his report on this was in the form of letters, personal letters, to several individuals who were simpatico friends of his, companions. The most significant in terms of the practical development was a man named Collinson, Peter Collinson, in England. And Collinson realized that Franklin's work was the most important work of that whole century in terms of physics. Franklin was the Nobel laureate in physics of the 1700s. And he collected all of Franklin's letters to him together and published it as a book on Benjamin Franklin's Philadelphia experiments with electricity. It was published in 1754, and immediately, across the whole range of intelligent men and women, mostly in the Europe of the day and the United States of the day, because that was where the distribution of the book went, but very quickly it went very far afield to many other districts of the world. It was recognized that Franklin had become a pioneer in a totally new level of humanity. That electricity in some way is a supernatural fire. And just as the ability to hold and make fire transformed Paleolithic man into Neolithic man, Franklin's taming electricity is like a differential fire, a conscious fire that allows for man to at least reform his whole being on this planet on scale of introduction of fire. We still have just begun. The worldwide internet is just one little tiny slice, current slice, of what Franklin's work means. We're only about 240 years into it. Franklin's work has the potential of making incredible transformations. For Franklin, what his realization was when he saw his book published in England and copies were sent to him, he got it right away. That his responsibility was just beginning with the publication of that book. And what he got, what he saw, was that the social forms of man, still tied to the tribe, still tied to feudal cultures, still tied to empires and colonies, still tied to all kinds of now apparently outdated human modes of cooperation, envisaged for the first time in his own private self, envisaged for the first time the glimpse of a vision that there should be a new kind of government never before seen on the earth to allow for the maturation and growing up of men and women who would be able to explore this whole new world that he had pioneered. But the idea was so profound, so ahead of its time, so outrageous, that he had to be circumspect, and the only example that he had was the ancient Greek democracies, the time of Thucydides. That was the only time when a fairly large population of human beings, of men and women, put together an operative democratic form that in many esoteric ways continued its experiment on down even into Franklin's own time. Though the democracy in Athens died, and it died because of the Peloponnesian War, and we're going to talk about the major figure who caused that death. Even though the Athenian democracy died ignominiously, even famously, it died because of a flaw that could be corrected. In other words, it was not a flaw in the structure of democracy. The form, the conscious form of democracy, does not have a strategic flaw in it. The flaw was in a type of individual who is absolutely anathema to democratic forms. Cannot, if included, lead to anything other than a tragic debacle. And that figure was Alcibiades. And in Thucydides, just as the most profound figure at the beginning of the Peloponnesian War was Pericles, so too at the end of the Peloponnesian War, the most profound figure was Alcibiades. And Franklin had this example before him. And so in 1756, about a year or so following when his book finally made it out and was seen, his experiments with electricity, Franklin began, like a good chess player, to begin moving the pawns in a game that would eventually lead to moving the queen to checkmate the old social order. And that checkmate would come during the Revolutionary War for American independence. But the first move, the first pawn move, is recorded here in volume 6 of the collected writings of Benjamin Franklin. The total volumes, they're up to 30, and I imagine there'll be some 40, 45 volumes. So volume 6, very early on in Franklin's actual work, you find here March 4th, 1756. That's more than 20 years before the Declaration of Independence. Here's Franklin at work moving the first pawn in what will become the United States. The first pawn is his plan, published in his own paper that he founded, the Philadelphia Gazette, printed at his own printing shop, distributed by a distributing system that he founded, made available at the Free Public Library in Philadelphia, which he founded. Do you get it? Disseminated through the junto, the community of men who discussed intellectual ideas, which he founded. Distributed throughout the colonies by a lending library, which he founded. And carried on the first intercolonial road, the old post road, the mail road. He talked the British into building a single road and upkeeping it so that all the colonies were linked together. He was responsible for that. So here's his first move in the chess game that became the United States, 1756. His proposal was an association for promoting military discipline among the free men of Pennsylvania, who are not willing and desirous to act under the present militia law. All of this was to participate in the development of the French-Indian War, the French and Indians against the British. And Franklin wanted to organize the free men of Pennsylvania, and eventually then be a model for the other colonies, to have an armed and trained militia of their own. It's the beginnings of the Continental Army of George Washington. And Franklin is the man who, behind the scenes, fed this organization constantly. He was even feeding it during the Revolutionary War. We have in one of the later volumes a beautiful little note that he sends to George Washington saying, I can tell from Paris that you're having strategic difficulties because of a limited general staff of fighting a widespread strategic war against the British troops. So I'm sending you a genius general, even though he's only 19, 20 years old, General Lafayette. You can entrust him with authority because he's a very fine man. And Lafayette got there just in time to be the key deciding factor in the Battle of Yorktown, where the British finally gave up because they realized they were being out-generaled for the first time in the war. In those days, you didn't give up because of overkill. You gave up when it was apparent on the battlefield that the opposite generals were better than you were. And you held a little tea and got together and decided about what terms, and then went back to your estates. And it was Franklin who understood, even from a distance across the Atlantic Ocean, that the progress of the war was at a juncture where the right shift in the strategic balance of power could be made by Lafayette, the young Lafayette, who was a genius. He was a military genius. Before there was a Napoleon, there was a Lafayette. And incidentally, to tell you how great he was, after there was Napoleon, there was also a Lafayette. He became general of the armies again. Yeah. He lived into a very old age, very grandly, out at Lagrange at his estate, and was educating people even like James Fenimore Cooper into what democracy was really all about. And when Cooper, who had bad-mouthed Jefferson out of just the habit of the times, came back after being tutored by Lafayette, he wrote a beautiful book called The American Democrat, which is one of the classics of liberty. It's republished by far left and far right groups alike around the world. The American Democrat, because it has that tutelage of someone who understood for 50 years of fighting against the situations what's involved. That a democracy is a conscious form, and you have to add a fifth dimension of consciousness to all of your planning, and you have to use an energy which is differential, not integrative. But you have to base that differential energy on an integrative, squared, circled cycle, but allow it to transform into a spiraled openness. Then democracy is unbeatable as a form. It's a conscious form. It's unbeatable. If it is not handled in this transformed differential way, it quickly subsides into a mobocracy. And then you have the condition that Frank Lloyd Wright, who wrote a book called Genius and the Mobocracy. Then you have the conscious individual who knows what to do, but you don't have a population of people who understand that this makes sense, this is what to do. And it degenerates into a mobocracy. And a mobocracy always develops factions according to Plan B. always the same. In fact, Federalist 10 in the Federalist Papers by James Madison clearly outlines the problem of factions because it was well known. The problem of political factions is as eternally knowable as the problems of fractions in arithmetic. I always work that way, and if you know how to deal with them, you deal well. Franklin's public militia of 1756 also resulted in building a series of frontier forts. And that series of frontier forts, when you look at Franklin's diagrams, do not stop with Pennsylvania borders. They realize that you have to preempt the situation, and the farthest borders that Franklin envisioned were already on the Mississippi River in the 1750s. Now, when the United States came into being in the 1780s, some 30 years later, they were still thinking only in terms of the 13 colonies. They were still thinking in terms of the Appalachian Mountains. But 2 generations before, Franklin had already foreseen the Mississippi River. And the only student of his that paid attention to that, the only Aristotle learning from that Plato, was Jefferson. And Jefferson, of course, being a good student, put the last fortresses on the Pacific Ocean. And in order to make sure that they were safe, he sent Marines into Tripoli in North Africa to make sure that the Europeans understood that American power was not a local phenomenon. That's why the Marine song is from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. In other words, a differential consciousness that's working with open forms protects them by showing that the reverberations are indefinite, and we're only doing this for now, but there's any number of things that we can do. It's just like the space program being shunted by the mobocracy into a redundant dead end was foreseen by a bunch of planners who sent voyagers out to make a reconnaissance of the whole star system. And though the mobocracy can't see higher than the orbit of the next commercially successful satellite, there have already been Franklin, Jefferson, American visionaries who've already explored the whole star system, already understanding that the frontier that evokes a challenge that's worthwhile for the conscious dimensional human beings, who are very rapidly being born now, need at least this much space to play. That the creativity of their play is going to become neurotic, not to say psychotic, if they stay on one planet. They need at least that much space to really get the idea that it's going to take hard work and cooperation and dedication to get anything done whatsoever. Now, Franklin, in his work, records, in his autobiography, records that at the time that he was establishing the forts in Pennsylvania, he specifically went to take a survey of how all the little local experiments in democracy were doing as of the 1750s. He's doing his own sociological survey, his own anthropological work. How are all these esoteric communities that fled Europe, mostly for religious visionary reasons? And he writes of the most potent of all of those communities was founded in a place, naturally they called it Bethlehem. Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Yeah. So Franklin went to Bethlehem to see how things were doing. Yeah. He needs a sort of a Charles Grodin accent to get some of those comments across. While at Bethlehem, I inquired a little into the practices of the Moravians. Now we're going to come back from the break and we're going to talk about some of these backgrounds and go on into this and then go into Thucydides. What's important here is to conceive of a motion that's very wide flung and yet has a definite pattern that we're talking about this morning. Let's recapitulate and then take a break. History is a process like a ceaseless ocean, and it's only the person who has already integrated the whole natural cycle and transformed it into a vision has a chance to do anything that will stick, that will be real. To cultural forms, to tribal groups, to the ego, history is a phantasmagoria that they cannot operate in. It's like no gravitation, no air, nothing. And so all plans based on a population of people operating on those bases are not only doomed to fail, they simply are irrelevant. It's that fundamental. They're irrelevant. But because of a law of compensation, of psychological compensation, the ego, the tribe, the culture will not recognize irrelevance on their part. And so it overcompensates by making some fundamental doctrine, some fundamental, usually religious or political or cultural or social or egotistical. And so fundamental isms are projected out en masse. And it only takes one spark to set it off. It's like a volatile gas. As soon as you have that gas, as soon as there is someone who sparks that, some charismatic leader, some dictator, it sets off an explosion. And you have that kind of scene where from the egotistical perspective, from the cultural perspective, from the tribal perspective, from the regressed ritual perspective, it looks like a lot of excitement is happening when what is happening is a death march. One of the very best frame showing this of all time was done by a brilliant woman. And her name was Leni Riefenstahl. And she did it in a film called Triumph of the Will, about the Nazis having a get-together in Nuremberg early on in the career of Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich. And if you see Ms. Riefenstahl's film, you can get this tremendous ersatz energy that seems to be healthy, and yet from the perspective that we know now, historical perspective, you can see also the very points at which the whole thing implodes into a tragic sourness. And what seems to be health on the surface is the last flush of health to be followed by a long bruise into death. And she carries this across in the art form because she herself was a highly conscious individual. She herself was, in a way, being the beautiful, large-boned, blonde beauty, the kind of goddess that the Nazis would have worshipped. She was free to go on every level and go behind the scenes within it, but because she was a very conscious woman, she understood the games these men were playing. And you can see it in the film, in the work of art. And the whole import of that film is the triumph of the will is the last call of day followed by a long night. In a way, Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War is the triumph of the will film of its time, of 2,400 years ago. And Thucydides shows very clearly that though the Peloponnesian War started with Athenian genius at its apex under Pericles, it completely collapsed and never recovered with the figure of Alcibiades. Who was the teacher of Alcibiades? Pericles. It was his private tutor. Let's take a break. Where we left off was the realization that we've been developing now for a month. This is the 4th history lecture. And the realization is that in the historical process, it is persons who are the pivotal figures, and that in order to negotiate with a 5-dimensional differential energy process like history, we need to recognize that personality, not just the personality of the ego, but the transformed personality of the highly integrated, self-conscious individual, is the decisive factor. Let's say it again. There are no Marxist principles that determine history. There are no archetypes that determine history. There are no inevitable processes that determine history. The determining factor in history are persons. So that the only proof that we have of a good outcome is to have the population of men and women who are living it, who are participating in it. To the extent that men and women are not consciously, personally participating in it, to that extent, a regression sets in. And tribal mores, cultural values, egotistical preferences increasingly come into play. And all of those factors have a common denominator only on the ritual level. So that the degeneration always falls back to that kind of thing. It's like Indian arm wrestling. It always then falls back to some kind of agreed upon doctrine of activity. And the first indication of that, the pathological indication of that, is a society acquiring a taste for uniforms. Now, in this serious concern, which is the concern of our century, because there has never been a time where it's been as widespread, as long as this. The planet has been at war for 80 years. It's an unbroken war. And the very first person to ever diagnose this particular kind of form was Thucydides. And he writes here in his history. The history of this period, that is the period of the peace in between what was the first 10 years of the war. The history of this period also has been written by the same Thucydides, an Athenian, keeping to the order of events as they happened, by summers and winters, down to the time when the Spartans and their allies put an end to the empire of Athens and occupied the long walls and the Piraeus. By then the war had lasted altogether 27 years. And it would certainly be an error of judgment to consider the interval of the agreement as anything else except a period of war. The 1920s was a period of war as much as the First World War was. The 1930s were a period of war. And we have had an unbroken war for 80 years. One of the most perspicacious of all historical consciousnesses was William Faulkner. And in 1954, when he delivered his Nobel Prize for Literature speech in Stockholm, he diagnosed it very correctly. He said, we have grown up in a world debased by fear to such an extent and for so long that we have forgotten the qualities of character necessary to balance consciousness. And this is indeed the situation that we have, exacerbated now 40 years later by surreal levels of complication. The only way out, share of a ritualistic catastrophe, that is to say, not a nuclear war, but a regimented society on a level of tyranny that is unbelievable. The only way out is to educate and develop a population of men and women who will make the history they would like to have for themselves, their children, their grandchildren. Thucydides, in order to frame it, says that there was an oracle, the Delphic oracle, who said that the war would be thrice times 9, which gives it an archetypal quality of symbolic organization, thrice times 9. In antiquity, 7 was always the limitations of men. A 7-level form was always a limitations of men. It was the Greek word for it was hymarmene. But a 9-level limitation were the limitations on the gods, the 9 muses, the Heliopolis Aeneid. And what Thucydides is saying by this allusion in the history of the Peloponnesian War is that this form is a tragedy not only for men but for gods as well. Because it is only by the successful navigation of history that the objective cosmos actually comes into being, that the differential heaven actually is real. And without a differential objective heaven, divinity is reduced to only being gods. So in an odd way, the whole fate of an objective heaven rests upon the actions of men and women, in their ability to take their personal realities and put them into play in a differential cooperative form such that heaven really comes into being. Now put into religious language of Hellenistic Jewish times, it's only the community of the elect that make it possible for God to be at home in his heaven. Now all the way through history, from the time of Thucydides all the way through to the time of Franklin, we could carry it up to the present day, but for our purposes up to Franklin, in that 2200 years, the burden of developing interpersonal communities of vision largely rested upon men and women who withdrew themselves from the society of their day. Esoteric groups that went off into seclusion of one kind or another. It has a bad connotation now, but monastic situations, largely. Though celibacy and monasticism are actually peripheral to that development. And towards the end of a 2,000-year period, about 200 years before Benjamin Franklin, around the 1500s, these communities of men and women became very conscious of their historical mission, why it was that they were doing this, what their purposes were, the methods of achieving this, and then the determination to see it through and do this. And so from 1500 to 1700, in that 200-year period, the history of esoteric religious communities is a huge multi-volume encyclopedia. And the most profound of all of those movements were the movements of European perfecti who went to the paradise of the New World to carve out of an Eden-type wilderness the new vision of humanity. And one of the most conspicuous of all of those kinds of communities were the Pennsylvania communities around Philadelphia, in the city of Philadelphia, Lancaster County. Franklin was the central individual in the culmination of that whole social movement of about 200 years. Why? Because his printing office printed all of their pamphlets, printed the books. He literally, if you can get this, he literally personally hand set most of the type for all of these visions. He was like the human being who was the conduit of centuries of visions that had matured out of millennia of preparation, and he was the one. If there ever was a differential Moses, it was Benjamin Franklin. Yet, he, like Moses, he understood that the situation was such that he probably wouldn't get there. Moses could not get there. I don't know if you know your Jewish tradition, but Moses was forbidden to enter the promised land by no one less than God himself, because he shirked his mission. He tried to run out. And so the Spirit of Yahweh came in to kill him. You think the mafia is tough? And Moses was saved by his wife, by Zipporah. She's the one who saw the wrathful visage of Yahweh coming into their tent to kill her husband. And so she invoked a little used ancient ritual law. She took a knife and she cut the foreskin off their infant son Gershom and threw it at the feet of the wrathful God, thereby establishing a blood covenant with God, nominating her son Gershom to his service, but God in return having to leave the father alive so Gershom would grow up whole. And so Moses was able to carry out his mission on parole. But you're not going in. And so he could never go in. Franklin, in his way, realized that the preparation of several generations was needed and that he probably wasn't going to live long enough. By the way, he did live long enough. He lived until 1790. He lived long enough to see it happen. It's wonderful. Franklin understood that all these groups, the Bethlehem, Pennsylvania group was the most potent in terms of its effect on others, the Moravians. If you look at James Fenimore Cooper's Leatherstocking Saga, the Hawkeye, Pathfinder, Deerslayer, is raised by Moravians who were the first Europeans to blend with the American Indians. That is to say, they opened up their psyches and they became white Indians. They became acclimated to the wilderness so that the wilderness became a home. It became a paradise instead of a wilderness. Instead of a fearful wilderness, it became a promise, the promised land. And in a way, Deerslayer is the first white Indian. He's the first Native American. European who becomes a Native American. And in a way, Benjamin Franklin is the first Native American. He's the first consciously who acclimates himself to a visionary land that was not there yet but would be. He could see that it would be. So when he visited the Bethlehem, Pennsylvania group, ostensibly building fortresses in 1756, getting this militia together, setting the basis of what became the Continental Army, he writes, "While at Bethlehem, I inquired a little into the practices of the Moravians. Some of them had accompanied me, and all were very kind to me. I found they worked for a common stock, ate at common tables, slept in common dormitories, great numbers together. In the dormitories, I observed loopholes at certain distances all along just under the ceiling, which I thought judiciously placed for change of air. I was at their church where I was entertained with good music, the organ being accompanied by violins, hautboys, flutes, clarinets, etc. I understood that their sermons were not usually preached to mixed congregations of men, women, and children, as is our common practice, but that they assembled sometimes the married men, at other times their wives, then the young men, then the young women, and later little children, each division by itself." And what he's pointing out here in his own Benjamin Franklin way, very, not just going around the edge, not just being laterally subtle, but enveloping the whole thing in a visionary way. He's saying that the best of these kinds of communities from Europe had deep flaw in their relationalities between people. That class system on basis of sexuality. That class system on basis of age. That class system on basis of whether you were part of the community or shunned. Franklin, in one fell swoop, would eliminate all of these flaws by talking about a people who are not diced up by any of these false categories. But he ends this particular paragraph by putting his finger on the ace razor's edge of why this doesn't really work, the whole process of marriage selection, of how it is that children come out of what kind of birth situation. The boys were under the conduct of a young man, tutor, the girls tutored by a young woman. The discourses seemed well adapted to their capacities and was delivered in a pleasing, familiar manner, coaxing them, as it were, to be good. And they behaved very orderly, but looked pale and unhealthy, which made me suspect that they were kept too much within doors and not allowed sufficient exercise. We have to remember that Benjamin Franklin is the first to realize the therapeutic capacities of daily swimming. He swam nude almost every day. In a way, he's sort of like the godfather of the YMCAs. That daily exercise in the nude was like a part of the health of human beings, part of what we need to be healthy. So not only do they look unhealthy physically, but this also then has a parallel in the unhealthfulness of the way in which birth happens, vis-a-vis this. I inquired then concerning the Moravian marriages, whether the report was true that they were held by lot. I was told that lots were used only in particular cases, that generally when a young man found himself disposed to marry, he informed the elders of his class, who consulted the elder ladies that governed the young women's class, and as these elders of the different sexes were well acquainted with the tempers and dispositions of the respective pupils, they could best judge what matches were suitable, and their judgments were generally acquiesced in. But if, for example, it should happen that 2 or 3 young women were found to be equally proper for the young man, then the lot was resorted to. I objected if the matches were not made by mutual choice of the parties, some of them may chance to be very unhappy. And so they may, answered my informer, and if you let the parties choose for themselves, there'll probably be just as many unhappy, which indeed I could not deny. Incidentally, Franklin's wife, Deborah Reed, was the first person that looked at him in Philadelphia. And she was illiterate, and he taught her to read and write enough so that she wrote these very illiterate, loving letters to him when he was off in Europe very often. And he always had this deep, loving, kind regard for her. And he understood that it was the mutual interpenetration of people that made the common reality. And so you have to be with people in the way in which they are really themselves. Otherwise, no real alchemy happens. They have to be really who they are, and you have to be really who you are, and allow for free exchange, and only on that basis does a conscious 5-dimensional continuum make its forms of government and society. So that in a way, Franklin, harking back to Thucydides, understanding that the nature of the person is the determining factor, not only the determining factor, but actually the trigger of actuality in terms of reality, of what really happens. And so that history is a very odd kind of situation. He says that he wrote the history of this period by keeping to the order of events as they happened. So that the underpinning, the basement of a history is to have a chronology, to have a sequence. Now you can have a dated sequence, or you can have a sequence of events as they happen. For instance, in this course, in this cycle, it's very important in your history to keep the masks that you made in the ritual level as prior facts, prior evidence, prior consideration to the works of art. The paintings, the sculptures come exactly a year later, and so they bear a diagrammatic relationship of like a diagonal, but that the diagonal is complementary. So you have to keep that relationship. Now, whatever those masks were is a fact. Whatever masks you made for food, whatever mask you made for feeling. You can set those masks out and you can look at what was actually happening at that time. But before those masks, in nature, when we started, we took walks. We took 3 walks. Those walks are prior to those masks. So the correct sequence is that those 3 walks have to be prior to those two masks, and then the ceremony of those masks, and then what we did in myth, then what we did in symbols, then what we did in vision, then what we did in art, and now what we're doing in history becomes the act in history, the fact that we take into sequence in history. So that right there you have 7 levels. You have a year and 3/4. And what's missing from that then? What's missing from that chronology is the 3 months before you began the course. Understand? That the power of this conscious form now is that it extends itself back in time before you even began the sequence, before you even began the course. And that 3 months, though it is only 3 months, nevertheless, it is an integral part of your whole life before. And by taking a 3-month snapshot of that life at its juncture where your life began to encounter this educational course, the ecumene, by taking into consideration that 3 months and adding it to the 7 parts of the course that you've done so far, you get an 8-part form. Before we even get to science, you get an 8-part form. Now it's very difficult to talk about it. The injunction in antiquity was that one should not talk about this. This is what you do not say. But in our situation, we have to talk about this. It means that this particular form, this differential form, is powerful enough to be able to bring into its operative consonance, into the octave of its scale, your whole previous life summed up in that interface period, that 3 months just before the course began. Which means that by putting together the history of the 7 parts of this course plus the 3-month quarter before this course, you're now in a position to do a conscious alchemical transformation of your previous life. No matter what happened in your previous years, all of it now is subject to a transformation, not just a review, but a transformation in terms of more than just its meaning, its purposes, its objective. You're at one of the most strategic junctures there is in reality. Reality larger than this universe. That strategic juncture is that you're capable now of making the next step, the one that you actually choose to do, based on an overview of what really is valuable and meaningful to you, what you really do prefer, what you really feel at home with, what you really think is accurate in terms of yourself. You have this option now. It's one of those points of freedom that Schiller wrote his poem about, that Beethoven set it to a symphony. It's that juncture where you have that right. You have earned that right. That juncture, that decision belongs to you. There are no levels of gods that could usurp that on any scale, no matter how many dimensions one goes to. It's a point of absolute freedom for you to be exactly who you are. And in a very mysterious way, this is your trigger for the reality of heaven. This is your salvation. The salvation doesn't happen in heaven. The salvation allows you passage to heaven. No one not yet saved goes to heaven. You go to heaven after you're saved. It's like that. Didn't I tell that stupid joke about the Protestant minister who dies and goes through the pearly gates and they give him a brand new Chevrolet? And he sees this Catholic priest drive by in a brand new Cadillac. And he says, "Hey, that." And then this rabbi drives by in a Bentley and he says, "Well, what's going on here?" And Peter and Paul say, "Well, it's family." It's like that. However you are, when you get there, that's how you are. That's how it is. And if you're infinitely real, then heaven is infinitely real. It doesn't matter how much lobbying power the demons have, they can't change that. That's why the Irish toast, right? May you be in heaven half hour before the devil knows you're dead. Because once that's done, that can never be taken away from you. There's no way. And that's the hell of it for the devil. Not a goddamn thing can do. Remember that the gnashing of teeth in hell is because they can see how good it is in heaven. And part of the beauty of heaven is that you don't have to look at hell. That's the way they used to talk in medieval wisdom in the 14th century. In the Peloponnesian War, in Thucydides, he shows that the Peloponnesian War began because of Pericles. Because of Pericles pumping up the Athenian vision of their place in the world, that it's the best that could ever be, it's the highest it's ever been, who is more worthy to rule than us, and we're ruling on the basis of putting together a confederation of independent cities. So the Athenian Empire really is the best of all human beings collected together in various cities and merged into one grand alliance. And that the whole basis of the power here was strategic vision guaranteed by a navy. Whereas opposed to strategic vision guaranteed by a navy, was the old-fashioned plain cultural vision of the Spartans guaranteed by their army. And so you literally had a war between a bear and an eagle. The eagle was highly mobile, could go anywhere, but in order to attack had to come there, and the bear, while it couldn't go everywhere, was always ready and could not be beaten when attacked. The same kind of reverberation in the Cold War. The United States could go anywhere on the planet and even off the planet. And the Soviets, with their land armies and the Chinese land armies, couldn't do that, but also they were the bear where they were. And the same kind of a tandem has occurred throughout the last 2,400 years many times, and has always resulted in a decisive war. The whole purpose of the history of the Peloponnesian War is to show that a civilization at the point of making a cosmos or losing it, there's always a war. Whether it's the Peloponnesian War or the Trojan War or the Great War of India, the Mahabharata, or the Second World War, part of the Cold War, there's always a great war. Because the form of civilization, being a differential form, must be born out of the constants of many prismatic individuals, men and women, working together. And what stops it is that they do not any longer work together. and that the stopping of their working together has a surprisingly, devastatingly simple trigger. The disease is very simple, actually, although the effects are complex beyond almost reckoning. The disease is summed up in the character of Alcibiades, because the Peloponnesian War was a catastrophe. The Athenians lost it, but the Spartans also never recovered from it. Greece never recovered from it. And drawn into the fray were the Persians, who never recovered from it. All the different parties, anybody who participated in the differential form of the Peloponnesian War, never recovered from it. It was like a contagion that the illness, the disease, infected anybody who touched it. And the very conscious point of it is the personality of Alcibiades. And in order to show the character of Alcibiades, two of the most highly conscious individuals who have ever lived on the planet took the character of Alcibiades at a juncture, a critical juncture, in two of the most famous works ever written, dramatic works. One of them is Aristophanes in his old comedy, The Frogs, and the other is Plato in his dialogue, The Symposium. Aristophanes' Frogs, the god Dionysos is trying to decide what to do with the high level of conscious civilization of Greece, and he then brings up, in the midst of a conversation between Euripides and Aeschylus and some other characters, Aeschylus as the old genius of the old brilliant Athens when it was first coming into flame, Euripides the genius of the last gasp of Athens when it was dying and the light was going out. And so Dionysius asks both Euripides and Aeschylus what they think of Alcibiades. Dionysius says, "Very well then, answer me this. I came down here to get a poet. Why? To help our city survive, so it can stage my choruses. The one of you who has the best advice to give for saving the city is the one that I'll take back. Alcibiades is a baby who's giving our state delivery pains. What shall we do with him?" That's the first question. And Euripides says, well, how does the state feel about him? Dionysius says, it longs for him, it hates him, it wants him back. Speak your minds both and tell us what we are to do. And Euripides says, I hate the citizen who, by nature well endowed, is slow to help his city, swift to do her harm, to himself useful, useless to the community. Dionysius says, good answer by Poseidon. Now, what about you? And Aeschylus says, we should not let be reared a lion's cub within the state. But if we rear one, we must do as he desires. In other words, don't create the conditions within the confines of a state for there to be a superman. Alcibiades being not only the most handsome, athletic man of his time, the most beautiful, physically beautiful man of his time, but also the most talented, genius military leader, also the greatest speaker, also the one with the greatest facility at charismatic bringing people in on his side. So that here's how Plato shows the appearance of Alcibiades coming into the symposium. A short while later, they heard the sound of Alcibiades, extremely drunk. In the courtyard, he was bellowing, "Where's Agathon? Take me to Agathon." In he came, supported by the pipe girl and some other people who were with him. He stood at the door wearing a chaplet of leafy ivy entwined with violets and with ribbons galore trailing over his head, and said, "Greetings, gentlemen. Will you let someone who's drunk, very drunk actually, join your party? If not, we'll just put in a chaplet on Agathon, which is why we came, and then we'll be on our way. I couldn't come yesterday, you see, but here I am now. And I've got these ribbons on my head so that I can take them off my head and put them on the cleverest and most attractive man in the world, along with a public announcement to that effect. I suppose you'll laugh at me because I'm drunk, but even if you do, it doesn't make any difference. I know perfectly well I'm right. Come on, hurry up and tell me, do you agree to my terms? Can I come in and join you for a drink or not?" Everyone shouted out for him to come in and find a place on a couch, and Agathon called him over. So his friends brought him in. On the way, he started to untie the ribbons with the intention of putting them on Agathon, and they fell over his eyes. So he didn't see Socrates. So he sat next to Agathon between him and Socrates, who'd moved over when he saw him coming. As soon as he was seated, he embraced Agathon and put the chaplet on him. Agathon told his slaves to undo Alcibiades' shoes so that he could lie upon the couch. "There's room for 3, he said. "Fine," said Alcibiades, "but who's this third person? Who have we here with us at this party?" And even while speaking, he was turning around to look. As soon as he saw Socrates, he leapt up and said, "God, what's this? Socrates? You've been lurking there, waiting for me. And this isn't the first time. You're always suddenly popping up when I least expect to find you. What are you doing this time? And why here on this couch? I know you didn't want to be next to Aristophanes and his jokes, or anyone else who might fancy himself a comedian, so you found a way to share a couch with the handsomest man at the party. I need your protection, Agathon, please," said Socrates. "You can't imagine what a nuisance my love for this man has become." What a nuisance my love for this man has become. Alcibiades lived to be about in his early 40s. He was the one whose great speech in the history of the Peloponnesian War is on page 419, where he convinces the Athenians to scrap the peace and send a preemptive expedition to Sicily. That the Spartans have this great, huge land power, and they need all kinds of food, and the weakness of their land army-based power is a food supply which they're getting from Sicily, which was the western plains of ancient Greece. If we conquer Sicily, we can do it by taking the capital city of Syracuse. If we take Syracuse, we starve off the whole basis of Spartan power. He led the expedition. But in order to get the expedition underway, to get anger at a high enough level in Athens, he and his henchmen the night before mutilated the Herms in the city of Athens. Now the Herms were statues of Hermes, stone statues of Hermes that had an erect phallus that stuck out. And this was not a vulgar thing in Athens. It was one of the sacramental parts of the Eleusinian mysteries that blessed all the homes in Athens and opened them up to the possibilities of progenitive life. All the stone penises were broken off the Herms of the houses of Athens with the scam that it was like Spartan spies that had done this. Well, kill those suckers. Then it was discovered after the expedition was sent to Sicily that it was really Alcibiades and his men who had done this. So he was condemned to death by the Athenian council and recalled from Sicily. And on the way back, he skipped over and joined the Spartans and told them about the defects in the plan for the Athenian war, because he knew them, because he was the strategos, the central planner for it. And then when he got in trouble with the Spartans, he leaped over to the Persians, to Tissaphernes, and got in close with them. Then talked his way back into Athens of being another round at being one of the great leaders and won many battles, saying that he was trying to make arrangements secretly with the Persians all this time, and he really meant to sabotage the Spartans. And each time everybody believed him. Till finally he was making another shift. He was going back to the Persians, and on the way there he was assassinated by someone. What Thucydides shows is that he was the most perfect example of the Athenian man of his time. He was the most physically beautiful. He was the most mentally gorgeous. He was the most strategically alive. He was the perfect Athenian Superman. But he had absolutely no morals of dedication when it came to holding relationalities in sacredness and in value. He was an amoral Superman. And Thucydides says this is how the Peloponnesian War ended. By producing what Athens hoped it would produce and what Sparta feared it would produce and what the Persians didn't want produced, and it sank everybody. He was a Frankenstein of tremendous intellectual and physical beauty. And that's how the classical world ended. It ended with a personality like Alcibiades showing that you can have everything to perfection and not have a developed heartfulness. You can have everything. You can be the finest body in the gym. You can be the smartest boy in the university, and it's meaningless if you don't have any kind of conscious heartfulness. And so the tragedy of the history of the Peloponnesian War is that this kind of personality was actually produced and didn't work. That it was flawed completely through. It was this that stole the energy from classical Greece, and they never recovered. The answer to Alcibiades was Alexander the Great, who said that he was not a mere mortal like Alcibiades, but was actually a divine, heroic god himself. And being a god, his forms would hold on level of divinity. But there never again was an individual who would be the darling Superman of a conscious democratic state. When Franklin began educating a generation of New World people in the 1750s, 1760s, he began paying special attention to the fact that they should not depend upon producing some kind of super leader, but that they should have the ability to come together, dozens, if not scores, if not hundreds, if not thousands, of men and women who talk to each other on a more or less equal basis, and that the Superman would be the combined effort of their whole group. That the health of the democracy was not in the charismatic leader, but in the health of the people. That if the men and women are healthy enough to cooperate together to make what they want, they won't need a charismatic leader. The issue will never come up. And so the need to have the right candidate is already a symptom of fatal illness for a democracy. It's already sick. It's sick with that illness. Without Thucydides and Franklin being aligned, there's no way that one could tell that that's what's going on now. There's no way. Because that perspective, that vision, that diagnosis, while objectively testable and certainly provable to any degree of accuracy that one would like, you cannot make the diagnosis as a doctor of civilization without this kind of alignment. But what's scientific about it, and the first person to talk this way was Henry Adams. He's sometimes called the scientific historian, our own Henry Adams. He wrote that the laws of history are exacting scientific laws that one can come to understand them just as accurately as a chemist understands the laws of gases. And that once you do, then you can make conscious forms that work, but you can also understand regressive forms that are never going to work no matter how much energy you put into them, no matter how much time goes by. That they will simply be like good money chasing bad, an endless pit, a black hole. That human effort, once it's caught in that kind of regressive whirlpool, leads down to the black sands at the bottom of the ocean. There's no way that it's ever going to work. And the only way out of that kind of devolving tornado is, oddly enough, not some quick solution, but the patient educating of a generation or so of men and women who will get the waters flowing again. That's the only thing that one can do. Now in your material, we're going to shift next week from Thucydides and Franklin to Tacitus and St. Teresa of Avila. Tacitus is the great historian of Rome in the 1st century AD. Like Thucydides, he was a general. He observed everything firsthand. He saw the way in which the Roman Empire was made by Augustus Caesar and the way in which the Caesar line completely devolved into the maniacal situation of Nero burning the city to the ground. And then he observed, just like an immune deficiency virus that permutates itself, he saw that the infection leapt from the line of the Caesars to a different family line, the Flavians. And that this happened in 70 AD. And Tacitus singles out 70 AD, which was the year of the destruction of Jerusalem. Jerusalem was sacrificed completely, the same way that Rome had destroyed Carthage some 230 years before, for the very same reason. That the Roman plain engineering, agricultural, army type sensibility was that the way to stop an enemy from ever threatening you again was simply to wipe them off the face of the earth. And just as Carthage had been completely decimated at the end of the Hannibalic Wars, they ended by Carthage not only being destroyed, not only was every building burnt, but the foundation stones of every building were pried up. The ground was salted so it never again would grow any kind of plants. And the site of Carthage was a salt swamp for a millennia. They did the same thing to Jerusalem, but they did it not only to the city, but to the Jewish religion. And so the Roman Empire made special point of prying up the foundation stones of the Jewish religion and pouring salt on the very ground out of which it had come, so it would never again threaten them. And this was done not by the Caesars, but by the Flavians. Because while the Caesars that Caesar line, had a cultural antipathy to the Jews for certain reasons that Tacitus points out. The Flavian dynasty had a supernatural antipathy to them. And that this was much, much more virulent, much more contagious. And that kind of equality entered into the Roman Empire mind with the Flavians and is still there. The antibodies are still in the system. The infection is still there. And Tacitus is the only place that one can read and understand why it was that personalities in the Roman times became infected with this particular. Why was it this disease? Why did it take this particular etiology? Out of the thousands that it could have taken, or the hundreds that it might have taken, or the dozen or so that it should have taken, why was it this one? And it's in Tacitus that one begins to finally focus enough to see. Now, complementing that, I take one of the greatest mystics of the Roman Church, St. Teresa of Avila. There's no greater mystic in the Roman Catholic Church than St. Teresa. One of her students was St. John of the Cross. She is, without a doubt, one of the world-class figures. When you read her life, just like Franklin with Thucydides, St. Teresa of Avila, her autobiography is an angle of vision into Tacitus's histories. Even though she comes 1,500 years later, she is a direct line. She's like a soul core angle of vision into exactly what Tacitus was getting at in his histories. So we pair them together, and that's the next month in the history section. St. Teresa and Tacitus. Try to get them. You don't have to read them all the way through, but try to get just acquainted with them. And if you want to start someplace with St. Teresa, start with chapter 20, which is called Rapture and Levitation. Yeah. Would Elvis say, yeah?